Good evening, everyone. Usually I know how to use a microphone because I'm a comedian, but I feel under the pressure because there are some very important discussions and people here to guide us in these discussions today. Welcome to the Darebin Intercultural Centre for the IC Cultural Diversity Orientation. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming here tonight. What a beautiful full room of diversity, thoughts, in a now approaching cold seasonal weather. Thank God. I got a little worried. But you must be wondering, who am I? My name is Diana Nguyen. I am your MC. I'll be taking care of you. And I'm also a comedian. Does anyone recognise me at all? Some of you do, yes. I have a fan, thank you very much. Thank you, there we go, thank you. I have been standing in the middle of the aisle directing people to come and sit in the two front rows. So congratulations to our two people in the front row, 2 rows here. Showing up, very good. But I am also known as a creative entrepreneur. I've written a short story called 5 Ways to Disappoint Your Vietnamese Mother. And I've also have a web series called Fethi and Me. It has won awards all around the world and has 50 million social media views. And it's sharing what it is to be Vietnamese Australian. Thank you very much. I wish my mum was here to hear the applause. It's sharing the story of what it is to be Vietnamese Australian in a very small town called Springvale. Anyone from Springvale? I am local. Just across the river. Before we do begin, I'll just do a little housekeeping. There are 2 sets of toilets, firstly down the corridor here on my right, and secondly at the foyer when you've entered is accessible all-gender toilets with changing table in each area. Also, in an unlikely event that we may need to leave, I will be directing you like on an aeroplane, so please follow me. Staff who are wearing a blue lanyard, yes, thank you, Min, blue lanyard, or me yelling, get out, okay? You pick which one you want to do. Well, we'll get out of here safely. We'll head out the Shire Hall foyer to Gower Street or back through the doors where you've entered. We will assemble outside near the red brick memorial structure unless otherwise instructed. There's also a reflection room for anyone who needs a low sensory quiet or prayer space just off the foyer where you've just entered the IC. And I felt like I've come very suited in my attire with this yellow backdrop, which is my favourite colour, and I've come in green. And I feel like Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. Yes, thank you. It is an audience participation kind of night, but we'll have fun. Sometimes I like to tell people how multicultural Australia is by just introducing my career in the arts. I've been in this industry for 20 years, and you must recognise me from my TV shows that I've been in. Yes, if some of you have been here that recognise me. I was on a show called Underbelly. Thank you, for 20 seconds. Thank you. I was a Chinese cowering waitress hiding in the freezer. Yes, 20 seconds. I was also another show called Please Like Me on Netflix and ABC. I was on that show for 20 seconds as well as a Vietnamese waitress. Yes. And the last show I'll tell you about is on ABC, Jack Irish with Guy Pearce. I was on that show for... Thank you, you're all listening. And I played a Thai flight attendant, so Sawadee-ka, everyone. Yes, diversity, look at this face. Yeah, I have played every Asian country on this face, yes. And in that, I will now like to introduce to our Uncle John Terrick, who is a Wurundjeri elder, to welcome us to this country. Please give a round of applause.
Hi everybody, thank you. Just forgive me, I'm a bit nervous still. Wimajika, Wurundjeri Balak Yuman Kundibik, means welcome to our country, the land of the Wurundjeri people. I acknowledge my Wurundjeri Wurrung people as traditional custodians of the land. On behalf of my people, I welcome you to Wurundjeri country. So, all of you, welcome. I pay our respects to my elders, past, present and emerging. and recognise their ongoing connection to this land, waterways and skies. I welcome you all to country and invite you to honour and respect the traditions of the Wurundjeri people. First peoples of this land, on behalf of my people, welcome, Ngujin. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle John. Now I'd like to introduce the Mayor of the City of Darebin, Councillor Kristine Olaris. Give her a round of applause.
Okay, I'm short and not funny, so I'm going to stand here. Okay, thank you, Diana, for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone, and I'm really thrilled to be here tonight as your Mayor, also as a Macedonian resident of Darebin for many years. Thank you for being here to celebrate the cultural richness of our city through our second IC Cultural Diversity Oration. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, who are the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which Darebin stands. I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and I pay respect to elders past and present. And thank you very much, Uncle Terry, for your welcome, and extend my respects to you. So thank you. And to any other First Nations people who might be here too. It's an honour to be joined today by fellow speakers on this evening's program, and I want to thank them for their attendance and generosity in participating in this cultural exchange. So on behalf of Darebin, my heartfelt thanks to Uncle John Terrick, to Diana Nguyen, and also to Professor Fethi Mansouri, who you will hear from very soon. Before I continue, and in the spirit of today's event, I would like to just briefly acknowledge the late Councillor Gaetano Greco. Councillor Greco was tireless. For those who don't know, Councillor Greco passed away about a month, three weeks ago, I think. He was tireless in his advocacy for social justice and championed fairness and equity for people from a diversity of cultural backgrounds in our community. Throughout his long and dedicated career, and he was in his 17th year as a councillor, Councillor Greco served the people of Darebin and always made time to listen to the voices and perspectives of our community. Thank you so much to Councillor Greco for your service. Today, the 21st of May, marks the World Day for Cultural Diversity, for Dialogue and Development. The celebration of this day is led by UNESCO. I'm just going to hold on to that. Is led by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation. As the Mayor of a proudly diverse, creative, culturally rich city, I know how important this day is. Since it was first celebrated in 2002, UNESCO has promoted a new interpretation of culture, previously understood as the preservation of established cultural material, now emphasising the ongoing process of interaction and exchange. The intention being not only to highlight the richness of the world's cultures, but also the essential role of intercultural dialogue in achieving peace and sustainable development. The IC Cultural Diversity Oration is an opportunity to engage with these themes of interculturalism and multiculturalism. It's also an opportunity for the members of Darebin community to celebrate cultural diversity and to reflect on their own cultural practices. And indeed, these are the driving objectives and mission and vision of the IC programming framework. The IC is a special place where we create the space, time and opportunity for friendly and courageous exchanges, for individuals and groups to reflect on how they differ, but also what we share. I'd like to thank the IC staff and the community members who come here for nurturing and supporting a program where every person is welcome, valued and respected. Because we're all better off when everyone is able to belong, thrive and participate. We know that in Darebin, one of our greatest strengths is our cultural diversity, and we amplify this strength when we engage and share it with others. So thank you all and have a great night. Thank you.
It's okay, I'm a comedian, I can hold it. Thank you, Mayor. I was reflecting about who I am in this area, and I arrived here half an hour early and I decided I needed a bubble tea. And you know, the world is with you when you can get a bubble tea in Preston, and I did. But I want to share a little story about myself, being a Vietnamese Australian. My mother's a single mother, a Vietnamese refugee who came here by boat, settled in Australia, and there was something inside of me watching my mother struggle that I decided to want to give back. And I ended up working in community development in the southeastern suburbs and for 8 years, helping young people from the ages of 12 to 25 share their stories. And what I wanted to help these young people do was not to hide their stories, but let their stories come out and be proud. And that work also involved running drama schools, drama classes for these young people, helping them get their license, their LTP program, or helping them learn how to stand up on stage with their 2 feet rooted to the ground so they can share their heart to the world. And then after 8 years of doing that, I was made redundant. And then up in the road, at the church on the corner street here, I decided to go to clown school. And I was telling Fethi, like, I was working at the Royal Children's as a clown doctor today. And so it's kind of wonderful how all my work has been about people and bringing people, regardless of what background or what colour their skin is or what cultural background, it is essentially joy in every work that I've done. And I've had so much joy reading our guest bio on your website. And I'll try to make it as sexy as possible. But I'm very honoured to invite our guest to speak today, Professor Fethi Mansouri. He's a Deakin Distinguished Professor and UNESCO Chair, Comparative Research on Cultural Diversity and Social Justice. Very sexy. Deakin Distinguished Professor is the founding director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University, Australia. He holds a research chair in migration in intercultural studies. He's the UNESCO chair for the comparative research on cultural diversity and social justice, and was named Australia's top researcher in human migration in the Australian newspaper Research Magazine. He is also the editor of the Journal of Intercultural Studies, founding editor-in-chief at the Journal of Citizenship and Globalisation Studies, and founding co-editor of the International Journal of Social Inclusion. Wow. Can I also mention, there's 2 books as well. The Global Politics of Forced Migration and Racism in Australia Today. He will be speaking about cultural diversity in relation to multiculturalism and interculturalism here. Please give a round of applause to our guest. Welcome, Professor Fethi Mansouri.
Thank you so much, Diana, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I also like to start, obviously, by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, but also to acknowledge that given what's happened last year and that the struggle for reconciliation, justice and recognition is an ongoing one, and that it's a journey that we have to embark on and to continue to embark on with a lot of enthusiasm to ensure that we do actually get there one day. Want to thank also the City of Darebin Council for hosting this very, very important event, Mayor. And I think, as I said earlier, Darebin has stuck with me, and I've done some work with Darebin more than 20 years ago, had stuck with me as one of the city councils in Australia that really has always wanted to do things in a way that is very proactive, very inclusive, and also driven by certain values. And you've articulated those values very well. So thank you for your support. And also thank you to Melinda, I know she's somewhere there, who's really been doing amazing work in reaching out and in doing a lot of the briefings and preparatory discussions for tonight. So thank you. And of course, thank you to the wonderful Diana. Where is she gone now? She's there for very funny. I can't live up to that, Diana. So I'm going to stick to what I know best, which is scholarship and academic work. So I want to start by saying okay, I've got this. I need to. There we go. So I need to. What I want to do tonight really just to explore some of the key concepts that drive policy making in this space, right? So we'll talk about diversity, multiculturalism. So I want to try to really explain some of the drivers of these concepts and what they mean in real life in terms of policy making that impact communities and people, and also impact the way we relate to one another, right? A lot of my work is obviously disseminated in books. This is just some of the books that have come out that I'm drawing on. More than 20 books over the last 20 years published in this area, but some of the most relevant to tonight's speech are these ones. So Interculturalism at the Crossroads, Cultural, Religious and Political Contestations, the Multicultural Challenge, that's 2015. Then Intercultural Dialogue Index, the first ever global index on intercultural dialogue that was developed in 24. And more recently, some work done on doing diversity projects. I will try to read some of my notes, but depending on how we go with time, Diana, please remind me, maybe every 10 minutes, give me, I will try to summarize and make sure that we have plenty of time for conversation and discussion, yeah? So it will be a kind of a hybrid presentation. Try to share content, explaining some of these, they appear to be complex, but not very complex concepts, and then hopefully leave some time for questions and interactions and reflections, and in some cases even reflections that might not agree with everything that is going to be said, yeah? So what we are witnessing, I think right now, we've been witnessing over the last few years in terms of global events, be they elections here and overseas, whether it's crises or security crises, wars, obviously most recently in the Ukraine, in Gaza, environmental challenges, we are still talking about sustainable development, all of those things. As we navigate and live through those crises, for us who work in the diversity space, the question is and has to be, what role can policies of diversity play, right? How relevant is multiculturalism in that big scheme of things when we talk about some of those issues? How do they fit policies of diversity and multiculturalism when we talk about things like wars, climate change, pandemics earlier? How important is multiculturalism? But also, increasingly, we talk about interculturalism, and the mayor has alluded to, in today's social and political conversations. How do you actually bring them into the conversation? What do they mean? What do the isms, right? Interculturalism, multiculturalism, etc. What do they actually imply? What are the assumptions behind them? Why do we talk about one or the other? Why do we talk about both of them increasingly, right? And perhaps most importantly, how can a liberal democratic society like Australia bring people and communities together and build mutual understanding and social cohesion while also respecting the diverse needs and cultural identities of individuals and communities? That is a challenge. That is easier said than done. How can we do that? So these are fundamental questions, not just for politicians and policymakers, but also for us, migration scholars, who have and continue to explore, develop, and test some of these theories and some of these approaches. In recent years in particular, we've seen during election campaigns debates about migration and diversity. And we've seen how some of these debates have been really divisive. They've been polarized, and they divided communities. Why? Because we linked them to some other structural problems that our societies had, be they security or housing or inflation or unemployment, etc. So what some of these crises and conflicts have added is a more weaponized tone to the conversation that we should be having, quite logically, about how we can live together in peace, right? So talking about policies is a good thing, but weaponizing those conversations for political ends is not a good thing. But what I want to do now is really just to say, well, where do we start the story about multiculturalism and interculturalism? We cannot talk about interculturalism without understanding a little bit how we got to the multiculturalism space in the first place. So how and why did we come up with multiculturalism? Let me just be very brief here. Again, I have to always remind myself to do this. So before the recent debates about diversity and inclusion came to the fore, the way many countries approached immigration, diversity, and integration was quite different. And you've got here a slide to understand those differences. So as you can see, you have different options, really. You can ignore diversity altogether. You can deny it by explicitly deny diversity. You say, we don't want to know anything about your diversity. So you can overemphasize it, or you can realize it as a diversity advantage. And if you equate those responses with policies, you can see that the first one is what we've seen, for instance, in Northern America and the US, in particular, the segregation between black and white, black Americans and white Americans, and how African Americans have lived in segregated urban ghettos. Or you can deny it, as in with this assimilation in Australia, the White Australia policy, where we expect people who come here, whether it's Greeks, Italians, later on Lebanese, Vietnamese, Asians, we expect them to simply adopt the language and the culture of the society, and therefore leave their cultural identity at home. You go out, you are fully assimilated. Or in the 70s, we started to talk about a different approach, really. And that different approach was multiculturalism, to acknowledge that there is a multitude of cultural systems that people carry with them, which carries with them values, which carry with them certain kind of orientations, and that we are allowing those people to maintain those cultural systems, so long as, of course, they do not transgress existing laws and existing policies. That change actually started to happen. You can ask, why did we move, like Australia, why did we move from the White Australia policy to multiculturalism? Well, it was a historical kind of process in many ways, that Australia post-World War II needed to, as you remember, populate or perish. So Australia needed to grow the population. As the population was growing, in addition to the Greeks and the Italians, then we started to open up our migration systems, our migration programs, to also invite others, not just, so initially the Anglo Celtic white people, then Southern Europeans, then a little bit later the Turks and the Lebanese, and then the Asians, and now the Africans, etc. So that diversification was created by an economic need initially, but in the 60s, we've witnessed something very powerful at the global stage. We've witnessed the civil rights movements. And the civil rights movements had had many kind of objectives, but two of the most important objectives was racial and gender equality, right? So it's under the racial equality that multiculturalism was being talked about, initially in Canada, then in Australia. So that's how we moved away gradually from a very restrictive immigration policy to a much more progressive immigration policy, which opened the door not only for different people to come to Australia, but also for supporting them to maintain certain aspects of their cultural identities. That is very, very important to understand. But what I would like to explain to you that, unfortunately, in Australia, when we talk about multiculturalism, we think it's one thing. As a matter of fact, it's not one thing. It's many things, and we confuse what it is. So the first thing to remember that multiculturalism, and I did a lot of research in Europe and in North America, and in Europe, they use multiculturalism to refer to refer to the demographic state of affairs in a society. So France think they're multicultural. Why? Because they have North African migrants. Germany think they're multicultural. Why? Because they have Turkish and they have other migrants. And I keep on explaining to them, no. That is a demographic characterization of your society. It's fine, you can characterize it like that, but you don't have the multicultural policies to go with that demographic fact of life, yeah? So that's one level, demographic. The other level is the set of policies, like we had in Australia in the 70s. When we moved towards a multiculturalism framework, if you, maybe many of you won't remember, but if you read the history, you see that a whole infrastructure of multiculturalism was established in Australia. And you know some of them, MRCs, Migrant Resource Centres, interpreting and translating, community language schools, or you name it, yeah? We established an infrastructure that was driven by those policies. So it's not just that the population was changing, but there was an explicit set of policies to support that. So that's the second level. The third level is, and I should have started with this one, which is the political ideal for multiculturalism, right? So what does it mean to say that we are a multicultural society? It's not the demographics, it's not just the policies, it must be something else, something much deeper. And I like to summarize it, to simplify it and summarize it in what I call the 3 R's. The 3 R's are redistribution, that's economic justice, representation, that's political representation, as in including everyone in the political decision making, and that's also recognition, which is the cultural domain. So for me, the 3 R's are economic, political, and cultural. So if we don't do them very well, we're not very well represented, we're not representative of the diversity that we have. If we don't ensure there's economic justice through a good redistribution of resources, and if we don't allow for cultural recognition in the public domain, then we miss out on the deep, what we call the deep diversity, right? Not the superficial diversity that you see, as Diana very, very powerfully made the, diversity in her, they think, no, it's the deep diversity, where the key institutions in society and the key structures in society reflect who we are and operate in a way that reflects that. And I just open here short brackets to say, I always make the distinction between a multicultural society and a multicultural state. And I say, you might be a multicultural society, as I explained about France and Germany, etc. But to become a functional multicultural state, you must ensure that your institutions are different layers of governance, federal, state, and local. They have to operate in a way that reflects that, right? Otherwise, you are falling short. But despite all of that, we've seen recently, and not just in Australia, we've seen it in Europe, in the UK in particular, but also even I was in Detroit, in Massachusetts, in America, in Quebec and Ottawa in Canada. We've seen it now increasingly that multiculturalism is coming under a lot of strain, a lot of criticism. Yeah, so people are saying, yeah, it was okay, but now we have problem. It was okay, but now we are really facing some challenges, right? It's not working as well as it did in the 80s or the 90s, and people are starting to really question what they have once celebrated as a very successful model of diversity management, but also migrant integration. Remember, that's what multiculturalism does. It allows you to manage diversity in terms of who you are, but also it allows you to set up an infrastructure to facilitate new arrivals, newcomers, if you like, their integration in society. So it's critically important for us as a multicultural society. And it's then actually in that context that obviously we started. I mean, I could have shown you any article I wanted to, but this one I have to show you this one, because this is what you get in terms of people critiquing multiculturalism. You get people, I don't even name the person there, but you get the foreign invasion talk. This reminds me to the yellow peril language of the early 20th century. Remember? When we are setting up the White Australia policy. Here's the foreign invasion, but look at the they had another title. Australia is being swamped by non-English speaking immigrants who refuse to assimilate, right? And accept our values. So the values are only their values. They're not human values, they're their values, right? In the face of this influx, we are losing our identity. And this becomes basically the norm of the circulating public discourse on why multiculturalism is failing. It's failing because we are being invaded. People who are invading us do not want to assimilate, and they represent a threat to who we are in terms of our values and our identity, right? So it's an extremely kind of polarizing and divisive kind of public discourse that doesn't really help in any way or in any form. So it's in this context that we've started to see, in particular since the mid-2000s, 2002, 3, 4, and a new discourse on alternative approaches to diversity governance in the form of interculturalism. So what I can tell you about how it emerged, and I'll just summarize briefly, is it started with, I'm not sure you heard about the Bradford riots in the UK, where lots of community problems were happening, in particular involving Asian, Pakistani immigrants in particular. There was a very famous report that a colleague of mine, unfortunately, Ted Cantle, produced, 2002. And in that report, they spoke about what they called migrants leading parallel lives. So these migrants, these Asians, they're leading parallel lives in the UK. They're becoming segregated so much that they form their own community and they don't really interact. And that all is the failure of multiculturalism. So that's how it was framed over there. And therefore, we need to move away from that multiculturalism towards something new. So building on that kind of criticism, the European Union started to draft white papers on what they called a white paper on intercultural dialogue, right? Intercultural dialogue that would facilitate a strengthened social cohesion. That paper was published in 2008, right? And then that paper became the template upon which a lot of policy work that was done through UNESCO and through the European Union was being introduced in Europe, including something I'll talk about later, which is the Intercultural City Index. But you can see the shift from multiculturalism to interculturalism. Not so much the shift that is the problem in my view. What is the problem is the diagnosis of what was going wrong with those societies. That you criticize that which you don't have. So when French president said, and even at that time German Chancellor Merkel said, multiculturalism has been an utter failure, I was asking myself, but Germany doesn't have multiculturalism. What is failing in Germany is not multiculturalism. It could be all sorts of other policies, but it's not multiculturalism simply because you don't have it, right? So let me move on. So what is this interculturalism, therefore? So we talk about interculturalism, and I'm so delighted and I'm so happy that Darebin City Council has set up an intercultural center here for all the good reasons, of course. But I want us to think about why is it different from multiculturalism, and does it mean that one is substituting the other, or do they still have a role to play together in really managing some of these issues for us? Yeah. As I said, how interculturalism has emerged, but 3 key points I would like to make about interculturalism. First is that the diversity conversations that we've been having, in particular within multiculturalism, were framed in what I call opposites, yeah? So identity versus individual identity versus group diversity. Assimilation, as you saw in that newspaper article, versus multiculturalism, yeah? Exclusion versus inclusion, as in the Bradford case. Interculturalism offers a way to move beyond those what I call binaries, yeah, fixed binaries. It encourages more flexible relational engagements, that is building relationships, focusing on how people actually interact and connect in everyday life. Now, I must say, and I'm a big defender of multiculturalism, I must say that in multiculturalism, we have really dropped the ball a little bit in relation to that dimension. That we did not really work on having that two-way engagement, yeah? It's always been about those migrant communities, but never creating opportunities and spaces in our policies, in our urban design planning, to ensure that those two-way things are happening all the time, yeah? The second point in terms of interculturalism is it also responds to what we now call super diversity. You can ask me, what is super diversity? You're just talking to us about diversity. Well, super diversity is the notion that our identities are no longer just reflected in like someone coming from country A to settle in country B. It's no longer like that. They're multi-layered. They have intersecting stories, if you like. I mean, I was born in Tunisia. I spent a lot of time in Europe, in France. French was my first language, maybe. I spent a lot of time learning Chinese in China. I came here to study and I stayed here. So my identity is not simply as a Tunisian Australian migrant. I don't even see myself as a migrant because I've always been studying. So you can't really say it's about that, someone coming from country A to country B. It's much more complex. And nowadays, people can make those, what we call local connections. What the local connections means is you can be in a local suburb here in Melbourne or Victoria or whatever, and actually having strong connections with the town or a village in Eastern Africa or South Africa or whatever. So that all goes beyond simple diversity. And third is, of course, interculturalism was responding to this rise in xenophobia, racism, extremist ideologies that we have seen in the wake of a lot of global security problems. So interculturalism has become part of a conversation that is offering a more proactive, and I highlight, community-based response. And I should say inclusive community-based response, right? So slightly different from how multiculturalism was being pursued, interculturalism downplayed to an extent the individual differences and treated cultural and ethnic identities as dynamic and evolving. So a little bit saying that we allow within a group as in a migrant group, we allow for the individual to also say that, yeah, I'm part of this particular community, but also I have my own agency. I'm also someone who wants to move perhaps beyond that community, yeah? Not rejecting my community altogether, but I want to move out of it and I want to explore cross-cultural networking opportunities. And it avoids the extremes of assimilation on one side, which we saw earlier, and defensive multiculturalism on the other side. So you don't want to either completely assimilate and lose your identity, but by the same token, you do not want to defend your cultural collective identity to the point where you really reject everything else. Yeah, I'm just this particular background. So it focuses on shared values, meaningful contact, and mutual understanding. So these principles of interaction, reciprocity, exchange, and dialogue are at the heart of the intercultural approach. And they offer us a powerful way to build more inclusive, cohesive communities in our increasingly diverse world. I want to now spend a little bit of time talking about the features of the intercultural approach, and you wonder what this is, and I'll explain this nice diagram. So in my UNESCO chair role, I've spent 4 or 5 years surveying more than 15,000 academic outputs on everything intercultural. So I wanted to get to the gist of this intercultural thing, like not making any assumptions, not superimposing any understanding, not making any instinctive, intuitive kind of judgment. I said, no, we're going to do this through a proper systematic review. So we started with me and a small team. We started with more than 15,000 academic outputs from all over the world where we can find them, which, of course, we use inclusion criteria. So they all have to deal with intercultural something. And the analysis of those 15,000 academic outputs, we narrow it down to 300 that we analyze very, very closely, every single word, basically. So the analysis of that review, the 351, is what we analyzed very closely. But the starting point is what I've highlighted there. You can see transformation, equality, shared values, contact, prejudice reduction, of course, culture, and diversity. So these are the core basics of the intercultural approach that were generated on the basis of the largest ever systematic review of existing academic outputs. So we're not guessing what it means. We're not trying to make it up. This is based on cumulative knowledge that has been passed on. And if we want to then say, well, what does it actually, all of that, what does it add up to, right? So what it adds up to is 3 core dimensions. The first one is that it is relational. Interculturalism is essentially, fundamentally relational. That means it's all about interaction. It's a real two-way dialogue. Remember, two-way I'm saying. Not just monologue, it's a two-way dialogue between people from different backgrounds. It's not just about one group adapting to another. Remember, this is the mistake I think we've made. Always expect, as you saw in that newspaper, expect the others to adapt. It's not about that. It's about mutual exchange where both majority and minority communities learn from and engage with each other. So that's all of that is what relational means. The second one is it's integrative, practical integrative, right? It's grounded, practice-oriented. So it's not just an abstract thing, it's not just a theory, it's something that plays out in everyday life. It's about building real connections in schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, public spaces. It's about creating a sense of shared belonging through lived experience. Here, this is where councils come into it, when they design policies, when they consult about how even the urban planning of the area is going to be done in such a way that is inclusive and reflective of everyone who lives in that space, right? So it's not just an abstract thing. Thirdly, and I love this one, it's transformative. If you do intercultural and it doesn't change your attitude, you don't learn from it, it's not working. It has to be transformative in the sense that it transforms the way you used to think about someone, right? And why it's transformative? It's because that exchange, that interaction, that dialogue is meant to teach both parties who engage in it something about the other one that allows you to reduce your prejudice and to increase your understanding. And here, I'll tell you a little anecdotal thing why this has become so powerful. So it's actually started in the 50s by leading American psychoanalysts, psychologists who did a lot of research, and they framed it under the intercultural contact hypothesis work. So what this intercultural contact hypothesis did, and these researchers they became very famous, right? Names are Pettigrew, and what they were doing is the more contact you have between people of different cultural backgrounds, the less prejudice there will be between those people. So they call it more contact equal prejudice reduction. So this is the hypothesis. More contact, prejudice reduction. Of course, something was missed in the interpretation of this hypothesis. And this, I keep on pointing this to a lot of scholars, a lot of researchers. It says it's conditional. More contact equals prejudice reduction on the condition. There are conditions to that. And those conditions are that there is actually justice in the system and that everyone has equal say in even framing the conversation. And I can give you examples in where contact has not led to prejudice reduction. Yeah, think about the conflict in the Balkan, right? Where the United Nations tried to do that and it didn't work because the conditions were not really supportive of those. But what is important is that the transformative capacity and potential of interculturalism, if it's done properly, right? Now, I'm going to leave that one there for a minute. I'll come back to it. But what I want to say also is many people, when they see that I've written on interculturalism, I edit journals on intercultural studies, I work with the UNESCO, they think that I am no longer, I'm of the view that multiculturalism has something to offer. Far from it. As a matter of fact, I strongly support the intercultural approach with its emphasis on dialogue and meaningful contact, but I still believe that multiculturalism has a big role to play. So we cannot really do away with multiculturalism. And I don't see interculturalism as a substitute for multiculturalism, but rather as a complementary approach that can help us respond to the today's more complex realities. So, and the way I've been working with a lot of other scholars from Europe, UK, and America, we're working on what we call the complementarity of these diversity governance approaches in a way that multiculturalism still very much does the macro level policy setting very well. So it deals with those justice issues. It deals with setting the parameters right for states, whereas interculturalism operates most effectively at the local level, which is why, again, local councils like Darebin City Council can play a huge role in really pursuing intercultural strategy. Diversity and migration are complex issues, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We don't need to choose between the two. We can draw on both approaches depending on the context, the community, and the challenges at hand. Now, I want to show you, I shared with you earlier the systematic review that really canvassed thousands and thousands of academic outputs on interculturalism. And then what that allowed us to do is to have a very refined understanding of those key assumptions behind interculturalism. But what do you do with it? You can say, all right, you've done all of that work, you spent years doing it, but what do you do with it? Now I'm going to share with you what we do with it, yeah? So two things we've done with it. One initiative I led, one initiative was led out of Europe. And I'll talk about the two initiatives. The initiative that I led through UNESCO is setting up the Intercultural Dialogue Index. This has never happened before, that there is an index driven by data to see how countries are faring in relation to interculturalism. And this is the model behind that index, which builds on the systematic review. And if you look at this model, I hope you can hear me from here, you can see that it's driven by those values, the interaction, mutuality, etc., that it becomes captured in three key domains: legislative, policy, context. So for instance, in Australia, we have the anti-discrimination laws, the 1975 Racial Discrimination Act. That's very, very important. Unfortunately, we don't have a Federal Multicultural Act. Like Canada does, we don't. There are structural foundations as a dimension. And in that, you find things like socioeconomic equality, access to communication, etc. And the third one is the actual intercultural opportunities for engagement. And then you look at those dimensions. We generate components from those dimensions. So for instance, as I said to you, the legislative and policy context, we can look at multiculturalism and anti-discrimination, and then indicators we can see there, for instance, Multicultural Diversity Act or policy, measuring integration of migrants, dual citizenship, etc., etc. So we generate a lot of indicators, 31 indicators in total, right? Across those three domains, across those components that were identified. You can still say, but what will you do with all of those indicators and components, right? So this is, again, just I'm really shortening and summarizing rather brutally my own work. Here you find, for instance, for Australia, the scores that are generated. So these scores are generated on the basis of publicly available data from credible sources, like ABS in Australia, like the World Bank, for instance, we don't use any data that is not coming from that kind of source, right? So all the data here is from those sources that you can verify and you can also follow up if you want to, yeah, to dig into it. And then we use certain mathematical equations to generate the ratios so we can have a score. Australia does very well, actually, by the way. 7.78. It's not the top score, but it's probably the fifth best score in our index. But what it does here, it allows you to see where you can improve. This is really the important thing. It's not about the overall score. It's about breaking down the score in relation to those key indicators and see that you have a problem of access to communication, for instance, right? That is not good enough below 4. You have a problem with social contact between diverse groups, right? That's where interculturalism comes into it. So this is very important because it gives you overall how you are. It's like doing a general checkup at the doctors. You know, I'm quite healthy overall. In my case, be careful. Cholesterol is starting to become a problem, right? So it's similar here. Like overall, you're doing all right, but be careful. There are certain areas that if you don't proactively develop intervention strategies now, then you might have a problem down the track. We don't want to go down the track of either UK or France or even Germany in terms of what's been happening recently. So that's the intercultural index. Then there is something that's developed by the European Union in relation to the intercultural city index, right? So that's for countries, the one I've led the development of. So it deals with countries in general. The European Union did an intercultural city index, which is basically a program that includes a large number of cities now, including Australian cities like Ballarat and Melton. And I just found out recently that another city has joined, Salisbury. And it aims to assist cities, local municipalities in general, in developing intercultural strategies along 2 key principles. Firstly, by adopting a whole of organization, or what they call transversal approach to policy development processes. And this is done through reorganization, improvement, development, and evaluation of policy processes so that a diversity perspective is incorporated in all policies at all levels, at all stages by the actors normally involved in that policy making process. So it's a whole of organization approach initially. And secondly, by focusing on a whole of society, or what is become known as mainstreaming approach to programs and service provision. That actually is extremely important to understand properly what it means, right? So we want to ensure that service provision has different elements to it, yeah? And as migrants, over time, have differing needs, so should service provision, yeah? Ethno-specific, multicultural, and mainstream. And that complementarity is very, very important. And so that's done through needs-based policies aimed at the general population, thus avoiding the tendency in multiculturalism for policies primarily directed towards immigrant group. So we want to move away from that treating migrant communities as always completely separate from mainstream society, right? They are part and parcel of mainstream society, even when, even if their needs might differ from time to time. The Intercultural City Index still recognizes that some targeted services may be required in situations where migrant groups face entrenched conditions of disadvantage. So it allows for that still, yeah? It's not complete black and white. So in short, the index measures intercultural progress in a number of policy areas, collects information about those activities that reflect those areas across services, divisions, and departments, and then the results are analyzed, which the analysis then will generate strategic advice on developing intercultural capacity. And this takes the form also of models of best practice from other cities in the Intercultural City network. And as you can see there, there are certain things that the intercultural approach views in terms of equality as a commitment, diversity as an opportunity, not a threat, positive interaction, supports pluralistic identity built around a shared vision and common values, and then it talks about commitments, building a culture of openness and reciprocity, dismantling prejudice, etc. That reciprocity and that mutuality is a recurring theme in the intercultural approach. It's always about steering away from a one-way kind of approach to doing things. And unfortunately, in the 70s and the 80s, we've tended to do things in that manner, that, you know, here are certain services come to this community and then that's it, full stop, and you move on to the next thing. Here it really works on ensuring that there's always that two-way communication, two-way dialogue. And then it spells out exactly what you need to do to pursue that kind of intercultural city framework, yeah? And really it's, I mean, for me, what sticks to me that being extremely important, because I've already discussed a lot of the earlier points, is it does rely on robust data collection. So you really need to know exactly who your community is. It's changing dynamics, it's changing the changing manifestations of its identity, and then you have to ensure that the policies are designed in such a way that reflects that particular community. Of course, with benchmarking and with looking at models of best practice. Now, I said earlier that I have a particular soft spot for the Darebin City Council, and it's for a good reason. And I mentioned this to Melinda and Kristine earlier. It's because 20 years ago, Darebin City Council, the leadership at the time, reached out to me at Deakin Union. They said, look, we want to do a bit of work on diversity and multiculturalism. Can we do it with Deakin? I said, of course, come to Deakin. So we did this piece of research, and I titled this particular slide, Same Questions, New Answers. Because the questions that were asked of me 20 years ago, I remember 2005-06, were, is multiculturalism as a policy losing credibility in Australia? Right? This is, look at the reference, Mansouri and others, 2007, right? Has the level of discrimination against Muslim groups, blah, 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 increased? Is local government the most appropriate vehicle to address intercultural understanding in the community? So this 20 years ago, if I remove the reference, you would think we are talking about it in 2025, right? And it will be exactly the same questions. And that tells you something, unfortunately. You know, it tells you that we as a society, and it's not any one particular area or any one particular player or stakeholder, but as a society, as a collective society, we are really not making the progress that we should be making, right? And you can look at that from any perspective you want. And I've looked at historical data from the ABS on attitudes towards migrants, for instance. And I can tell you that in the 70s and the 80s, even the 70s, 80s, those attitudes towards migrants from particular backgrounds, like non-European backgrounds, were like the very negative, about 8%. Like what we call very negative, as in reflecting really racist attitudes, about 8%. Guess what? In 2024, 25, that very racist attitude has jumped from 8% to 14%, 15%. Now, that's the same kind of question in the same kind of survey. So we're not only not making progress, but as a matter of fact, we are backsliding. When we have to ask why, right? What are we not doing very well? And I think this is why I'm so enthusiastic and so pushing for people to test different ways of doing things. Don't do the same thing over and over again and hope for a different result, right? Multiculturalism is served us very well, but it has certain limitations. Interculturalism is able to play a role, a very constructive role, in revitalizing that multicultural ethos. So let's embrace that. I told colleagues, we can't have these arguments between concepts as the basis for policy making on ideological basis. Because all of us pro-diversity. Everyone who's in this space is supportive of diversity. So how can we do it in the best possible manner? So that's the questions that we had, and of course we had really interesting answers too, that you can see. This is from the 2007 research with Darebin, but interesting to see some community members saw multicultural services as only for migrants. So that but that separation, that lack of that multicultural things are only for migrants. I'm not. I don't have culture, right? If I'm a white person, I don't have culture. Of course, we all have culture. We all carry culture with us, and our cultural orientations, our cultural values, are reflected in the way we communicate, the way we operate, the way we do things. Yeah. So, and community agreed that mutual dialogue through social and educational interaction was a good way to promote intercultural harmony. So even then, you can see that people are talking about dialogue, interaction as pathways towards promoting intercultural harmony, right? Now fast forward to Darebin today, and I know, sorry Melinda, you sent me some stuff which I only saw late. So I got my own stats from the ABS on Darebin, and Darebin is even more diverse than it used to be 20 years ago. It's getting even more exciting to live in Darebin. Seriously, and look at that, right? Let's look at some of these. So language, there are more Greeks and Italians who live in Darebin than the rest of Greater Melbourne. So they're overrepresented in Darebin. That's a good thing. The same thing, Arabic, overrepresented in Darebin than in the rest of Melbourne, right? But look at that nice diversity there, including Vietnamese, Diana, but of course Macedonian, Cantonese, etc. So that's in terms of language. Religion is the same thing. Catholic, Greeks, Muslim, Anglican, etc. Very, very nice religious diversity in Darebin, right? So what I wanted to say by doing that analysis is that reflecting the principles of the intercultural approach that I've been discussing with you, as articulated both in the Intercultural Dialogue Index and in the Intercultural City Programme, Darebin City Council, with its growing diversity, is well placed to engage intercultural programs, increase civic participation and public engagement around diversity matters. Such intercultural work, reflecting the methodology outlined in the ICC that I've shared with you earlier, should be based on the core values of equality, inclusion, active citizenship, and non-discrimination, all pursued through the core IC principles of dialogue, exchange, and interaction. Now, while I'm reading my concluding remarks, I want to share with you some of the academic sources for this paper, so that if people want to go and read more, they can do that. But there are reasons why interculturalism is starting to take hold in diversity policies in Australia, but also elsewhere in the world. Key triggers include increased and diversified forms of human mobility, as we spoke about earlier, emergence of a new superdiversity that goes beyond fixed binaries, and a sense of a weakening social cohesion not helped by a perceived groupism, collectivist multicultural policy approach. That's a perceived groupist issue in multiculturalism. Within such a context, one of the most important contributions of interculturalism is that it's helping to broaden the conversation around diversity, prioritizing dialogue, interaction, and transformative learning. Indeed, for a long time, diversity has been framed narrowly, focused mainly on minority or migrant communities, and sometimes even problematized in that context. But interculturalism shifts that perspective. It brings everyone into the conversation, including members of mainstream and majority groups. This broader, more inclusive approach is absolutely essential. It's not just about recognizing difference, it's about building mutual respect, shared understanding, and a sense of a common purpose. When everyone sees themselves as part of the diversity agenda, it becomes easier to foster solidarity, not just within local communities, but across borders and across cultures. In this way, interculturalism doesn't just help us to manage diversity, it helps us to live it together. It invites all of us to take part in shaping a more connected, respectful, and inclusive society. Thank you.
Well, there were quite a few and in my in your presentation. I guess the big one, which was surprising and maybe not surprising, is the stats. 8%. That was recorded of racist attitude has risen to 14%. And I wonder, back in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, it was, have a chat to your neighbour next door with the fence. Yes. But now that social media is in our world now, do you feel like that has also, segregated us even more? Does that, like, social media has an impact? No?
Yeah, I think definitely social media, digital platforms have amplified a lot of these issues, no doubt. But you have to remember that even 8% back then was quite a high percentage. And the 14 or 15% today in Australia, if you compare that with some European jurisdictions, it's even higher than that. It's about 30% in some places. Same data, it's 30%. So clearly there's something happening around the world right now, which is leading to more polarization, more kind of inward-looking outlooks on the world. And I think a lot of these stress points, I call them, conflicts and what have you, and crises, are not actually helping. Because it's focusing people's minds on their own backyard and their own communities, and so it makes the notion of solidarity beyond your own rather difficult to achieve, unfortunately.
We're going to go straight to a question in the audience. Thank you for using a QR code and having this dialogue with us. The first one is, what's the difference between interreligious and interfaith?
That's a very good question, yeah. So within UNESCO, we use more interreligious. So for instance, I run a UNESCO network on interreligious and intercultural dialogue. Interreligious seems to be more inclusive as a concept, because it includes people who are, for instance, what we call no religion, right? Non-believers, atheists. It recognizes that as part of the diversity, and we tend to use the broader, the more inclusive term rather than the interfaith. Yeah. Other than that, there's not really. I mean, you see them used interchangeably a lot, but to clarify, one is more inclusive than the other. Okay.
I'm loving the music and the phones. Since the transformative potential of interculturalism is conditional on justice, can local government initiate the policies that promote the justice structures that is needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, we cannot really place all the burden on local governments to do the heavy lifting in terms of justice, because justice is always has a deeper, more structural kind of manifestation to it. Usually economic policies, who sets economic policies, legal systems, we know who obviously changes laws, but local governments increasingly have a big role to play in terms of things that can happen locally. As I said, urban design is a very good example. Making decisions about new initiatives locally, supporting certain programs. I call it the soft power. There's a lot that can be done with soft power that could engender better justice outcomes.
Your data on religion show that only approximately 45% of the population is identifying with a religion. In your opinion, is this a decline of religion indicative of less socially inclusive trend?
That is a very interesting observation, and it's a very interesting trend actually. If you look at the ABS census data over the last 15 years, the biggest growth in the religious data is non-religion. People who take no religion at all, yeah? it is actually now almost the majority of Australians who take no religion. That is not just an Australian phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon, unfortunately, including in some Muslim countries like my own country, where there is a rising level of people who are no longer subscribing to any particular religious denomination, and they take the non-religion. Now, whether that everyone who takes that is genuinely non-believer, we don't know, but people choose to tick that box, and it's indicating a really global phenomenon now of people maybe not wanting to subscribe to institutional religion as much as they used to.
What was that box you said? It was no religion.
No religion.
Because
Yes.
we've got an audience here, could you raise your hand if you would tick that same box as well?
There you go, you see?
Yeah. We can't see you in the dark, so you're all hidden. You're anonymous. Don't worry, we won't track you down. Okay, interesting. How can we ensure that interculturalism works with acknowledging the First Peoples?
As a matter of fact, you I in my written comments, we cannot do anything in terms of intercultural or even multicultural without giving priority to First Australians, Indigenous people. It's one of the biggest failures of multiculturalism in Australia is that we've never really managed to reconcile it with that fact that this land, and as a matter of fact, migrants themselves are settling on the land of the First Nations people, and that without acknowledging that long-standing, ongoing connection with land and waters that Indigenous people have, will always have a sense of incomplete realization of the multicultural/intercultural project, definitely. And as a matter of fact, some jurisdictions do it a little bit better than us. So in Canada, for instance, to give you an example, they don't differentiate. When they talk multiculturalism, it incorporates conversations about how also to extend support to Indigenous Canadians. In Australia, there is this separation between the two. So you can't really. I remember once I was doing a grant submission about youth, migrant youth, and I wanted to include Indigenous youth. And I was told by so many people, you cannot put them together in the same study design. I said, but why not? Because of this and that, yeah. And so, in my view, a lot of it is really manufactured kind of issues and problems, whereas you always need to have your points of reference, points of framing, if you like, in relation to Indigenous Australians, definitely.
For people who don't have access to a phone or understand the QR code, Pamodika is at the back, who is also can write down your questions if you can't access the app itself. So please make sure, if you do want to ask a question, we want to have you to have access as well to the conversation here. How can we ensure that interculturalism works? Oh, so we've done that one. Thank you. I'll archive that one. Thank you. Technology. You say that racism has increased in Australia. In general, how has the general population evolved? Has Australia become generally more multicultural or less?
That's you need to break it down, that question.
Yes.
So Australia is definitely, as I said earlier, multiculturalism means lots of different things.
Yes.
So there's the demographics, the policies, there's the ethical commitment, if I can put it like that. So yes, it's more multicultural demographically. I mean, remember that I think 18 months ago, we've become, for the first time in Australia's history, as what we call migration majority country, meaning that more than 51% of Australians are either born overseas or at least have one parent who's born overseas. That happened for the first time 18 months ago,
Wow.
about 2 years ago.
Yes.
So yes, we are becoming more multicultural like that, but are we doing multiculturalism better? That's a different question. And as I said earlier, we have lots of success stories in Australia. As a matter of fact, when I do comparative work, especially when I'm overseas, I talk up the successes because we really do much better than almost most other jurisdictions, right? But it's not perfect, and there's a lot of areas where we need to improve.
There's a similar question I had in my brain, but someone's also asked it, so thank you for reading my mind. You said Australia is number 4 on the index.
Yeah, when you look at the data.
Yes. The question is, what is the country with the best intercultural index?
So,
We're very competitive now.
so no surprise, I think from memory, some Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Canada, but only just ahead of us. Yeah, I think Sweden, Norway, Canada, from memory. A couple of Scandinavian countries and Canada. And you know why Canada actually scored better than us? If you take the multicultural federal act that Canada has, I think Australia would have scored higher. But Canada ticks that box. They have a multicultural federal act. We don't. Right? So.
And so, is that something that the most recently elected government need to action?
Yeah.
Are you hopeful that will happen?
Well, we're not only hoping for, but I've written submissions and I've taken part in reviews, like the multicultural review that we did 2 years ago. And in every single parliamentary inquiry into multiculturalism, not just myself, a lot of colleagues, we write and we say there would be no Armageddon by having multicultural federal act. As a matter of fact, all of the states have them. Victoria has it.
Okay.
Victoria has a multicultural.
Federally.
But no federal, exactly. So you can have a multicultural federal act. Why it's important? Because it actually gives you the vision at that level, macro level, to signal that this is who we are and this is how we're going to go about doing it.
Sorry, can I just cut in there and say, shouldn't that be an intercultural act rather than a multicultural one?
No.
In terms of what you're talking about?
No. And do you want me
We're
to tell you?
still in the stepping stage.
No, not only that. Because what I've said, and I hope I've made it very clear, is multiculturalism still acts at the macro level of policy making. And that's best captured by federal kind of legislation. Interculturalism works best at the local level because it's all about those interactions and So as a matter of fact, we need both. Yeah, we need both.
And we'll just go back to, I've got an iPad full, not an iPad, a screen full of questions, and I'll make sure you indicate to me for time as well. Thanks, Min. Should interculturalism be a subject taught at schools and universities to bring more education and awareness? And I feel like yes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll tell you why it's a very good question. Because as a matter of fact, back in 2012, the federal government, I think 2012, where we had Julia Gillard as Prime Minister, if I remember correctly, or it's still Kevin Rudd? Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard?
Gillard.
Sorry?
Gillard.
Yeah, one or the other. Because I remember Julia Gillard did the social inclusion agenda. But what they did also in 2012, because I still have the paper, is the Department of Education, not them personally, the Department of Education issued the Intercultural Competency Framework paper for schools. So they outlined how the Intercultural Competency Framework can be translated into teachable competencies in schools, right? With a very nicely written document, not very long, like 6-8 pages, but extremely precise and actually we did it. So I, with colleagues from Faculty of Education, School of Education, we applied for funding, got the funding, and tested that model across 12 schools, 6 primary and 6 secondary schools. And guess what? It works. So there's a change in the attitudes of youth, from all youth, not just migrant youth, in terms of towards other communities. And what is even more interesting is that the positive change wasn't just like immediate. Even we did delayed testing, so we went back 6 months later and tested, and some of those gains in terms of positive attitudinal changes remain with the students. So if you teach intercultural competencies properly in schools, it has a lasting impact.
And what you're also saying is it doesn't happen instantly, does it?
No,
You need it's a durational.
Diana, this is hard work.
Yeah.
That requires a lot of investment, that requires a lot of knowledge, that requires different people with different capabilities working together to ensure that one, the intervention or the strategy is right, and two, you can resource it and sustain it, and three, you can convince others to engage in it. That is not an easy thing to do.
Why do you think Australia doesn't have a federal act like Canada?
I wish I could understand why politicians are worried about having a federal multicultural act. I don't know. actually in these submissions that we've written, I've written my own submission, we made the point that neither in Canada, nor in Victoria, nor in South Australia, all of them have Multicultural Act, nothing has happened. Migrant communities did not do anything like, well, you know, they're demanding more rights, or there's no civil war. It only signals the state commitment to that multicultural view of things, if you like, yeah? Canberra is still of the view that it's not needed, that we can really do things without having a federal multicultural act. Various ministers, you know, they listen, but still there's no political will to do it. I don't know. I'm puzzled. I'm disappointed, of course.
I guess keep submitting those papers.
Yes, we could do it.
Will happen. By focusing on urban design for interculturalism, what are you referring to?
So a lot of, if you look at some of the cities in the Intercultural City Index network, and you look at how they approach planning at the local level, you see that there's a lot of consultation on what is done with public spaces. So that public spaces become much more fluid, much more welcoming, much more multi-purpose, if you like. So that, let's say, take spiritual centers. Spiritual centers become places where Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Christians can actually congregate and do their prayers if they want to. A lot of other space is designed and built physically in a way that allows for communities to come together. So it's all about ensuring that the urban design of the place is open, welcoming, and allows for different groups to feel like they belong, it's theirs, rather than, as we know in Australia, for instance, recently we have a lot of problems with issuing building permits for certain things, right? I don't want to mention what, but you know what I'm referring to. That doesn't really usually signal that you are welcome in that community, right? But I'm going a step further. I'm saying you need to do things that bring everyone together, not just, you know, mosque for Muslims and a temple for Sikhs or whatever, and a synagogue for Jews. No, I'm just saying places of spiritual connection, for instance, places for arts, places for sports, need to be really all designed with that in mind.
And I feel, maybe I'm a bit biased because I'm emceeing this event, but when I walked into this building, I felt that this is a space where people can have that conversation. And so it's really exciting. And so this space has been open for 2 years.
Yes.
But here you are, we're having a conversation. People are like, well, what's happening in the world? Why do we not have a federal act? So it's good. I feel like this is a great space that's been created.
And I've said this to the mayor and to other colleagues, that actually Darebin is one of the very few local councils that have an intercultural centre. And they've had it for a while, right? So that in itself signals something. And I just hope that it can be utilised to really project that kind of orientation that the council wants to develop.
We have a question from across the world.
Yes.
How do you think that Trump's ban on DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives will affect intercultural opportunities in Australia?
Well, I mean, in a way, you know, we heard from some political leaders that Trump squeezing, if you like, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and putting bans on recruitment. Not only that, but cancelling contracts and cancelling work, and that was really going to be also copied here to some degree. And at least I'm glad that that particular narrative did not pick up here, and that but definitely would have had a huge impact. Absolutely. Sorry, you want to say something or about DEI?
I was just thinking, because part of Trump's thing is that the relationships between, say, universities in the United States with universities here is that you've got to cancel a DEI here.
Yes, and we thank you for that. We actually had 2 projects held by a colleague of mine who were told they needed to fill out a survey and answer questions like that, and when they ticked those questions, then we received something saying this has been cancelled. So do not spend any more money for this grant because you're not complying with his directive not to. Yeah. So you're right. So we really create a lot of problems for collaboration. Yeah.
We have one more question. I have a full list here, but I do want to end on this one, which is, are you optimistic that Australia will embrace intercultural model in order to become truly inclusive in decision-making positions in public service, corporate, not-for-profit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very optimistic. I'm always optimistic. I have to be optimistic to stay in this area for so long. No, I'm very optimistic. You know why? Because to initiate, to develop, to introduce, to sustain intercultural strategies, you don't need the federal government. You don't even need the state government. You need to have leadership at the local level that is really fully committed and fully understanding of why it needs to be done, and then you can have a lot of successful initiatives. And that's what we are seeing with the Intercultural City Index, that a lot of local cities have the flexibility to make those decisions and to introduce really, really innovative intercultural strategies that have delivered very well. I was for a couple of years on the international jury of the Intercultural Innovation Awards, which is done by the UN and sponsored by a very famous, I'm not going to mention, car-making German car model. And for 2 years, I used to read 500 plus submission for the Intercultural Innovation Awards. And there is an amazing kind of work that's been done from all over the world, from local councils, local NGOs. So you can do it. And you don't need a lot of resources usually to do that. So no, I'm very optimistic.
So am I. Please give a round of applause to our guest, Fethi Mansouri.